Just want to test, Mayor Nuttall, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the meeting of the Barrie Police Services Board for February 20th, 2025. I'd like to call the meeting to order and begin with our land acknowledgement. In keeping with Indigenous protocol and building respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, it is customary to acknowledge the traditional territories and ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples. We would like to acknowledge this sacred land on which the Barrie Simcoe Emergency Services Campus operates. It has been the site for human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the ancestral land of the Wendat and the Anishinaabe Nation. The treaty that was signed for this particular parcel of land is collectively referred to as the Williams Treaty. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land and are committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect. Thank you. Our agenda was distributed in advance. A motion to approve today's agenda, Mr. Ron. Mr. Ron, any questions, corrections, or amendments to today's agenda? Seeing none, those in favor? Thank you. Any conflicts of interest that any member needs to declare with respect to today's agenda? Seeing none. Thank you. Our minutes for January 23rd, 2025 public meeting were distributed in advance. A motion to approve those, please. Mr. Ron, any amendments or changes to those minutes? Or seeing none, those in favor? Thank you. I should add, for those that may be watching live, Mayor Nuttall has joined our meeting virtually. I'll hand it over to you, Chief, for our first presentation for the day. Chief Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I'll ask our organizational researcher, Madison Sharman, to come up, as well as our tactical crime analyst, Samantha Scott. So this is our triannual stats update, and I think it's going to go right into the new. Yep. Okay. So it'll be one presentation with the hexagon deployment as well at the other end of it. But again, appreciating it's a data-driven organization, and it informs our decision making with the experience of our officers. I'll hand it over to Madison.
Good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Morning, members of the board, public, all the BPS members in the house. So today we're going to go over two topics in this presentation. I know the agenda says it's two separate ones, but we just combine them. So we'll have the full 40 minutes for the presentation and questions. So we're going to be doing our triannual statistics update, as well as talking about our hexagon deployment. So data and reporting. My name is Madison. I work with the research unit, and I'm here with Samantha. So we continuously monitor all of our data. We present it 3 times a year. So usually which would have been January. This month it was pushed back to February. We're presenting our recap of our 2024 stats. So just an overview, like I said, we'll go through our statistics, our calls for service, our crime stats, and our harm stats. Then we're going to look at a harm spot update and talk about the reshuffling of our mapping using hexagons. So just as a refresher for everybody, at the Barrie Police, we use 4 levels of measurement when we look to measure safety and police activity. We look at CAD-created events. So those are things and calls that come into service that could be through non-emergency line, 911, officer generated. This is a general indication of the volume coming into the service. From there, that can be parsed out to social disorder. So those are often non-criminal calls, often relating to quality of life concerns. On the other end, each event or CAD-created event is then given codes for better context within our data. Those are called UCR codes, and that's where we determine criminal and non-criminal within our events. And then those criminal events are then given a harm score. So that is derived from Stats Canada, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But those are our 4 levels of measurement that we use when analyzing our data. So looking at our first one, which is CAD created events. So this is mainly volume that comes into the service. We are slightly lower than we were last year, sitting at about 76,000 calls for service coming into the police station. 50% of that was triaged by our communicators, and the other 50% were handled by our officers. In 2024, our officers dedicated over 80,000 frontline hours to answering these calls for service. And when we break down on the type of response these required, it actually breaks very nicely into thirds. So 1/3 was 1 unit needed to respond, another third was 2 units, and then the last third was 3 or more units to respond to these calls for service. What we're seeing is a little bit interesting in terms of a shuffle of the composition of our calls. So we have actually seen our lowest non-emergency proportion since 2021. So that's really indicating a shift in our calls. Mainly, we've seen a large increase in proactive policing. We've seen a 40% increase in traffic enforcement in 2024. That takes up a large volume of our calls for service. Our biggest chunk that we deal with is the priority 3s and the priority 4s. So that takes up a large amount of volume. So we've been looking at evidence-based and innovative responses to better handle these calls, freeing up time for our frontline to handle those emergency calls going from priority 0 to 2. So things such as our virtual call response that we've been trying out, just looking at better ways to respond to the community in that sense. Our busiest times we see between 10 and 6 p.m. and our higher priority calls peak between 2 and 8. And when we look at our calls for service, the source of them coming in, most of them, so 47% come in through our non-emergency line. We have 37% through our 911 line and 16% officer generated. And then we also have things coming in through our online system, which recently in November got an update for our online reporting system, and then walk-ins. Okay, so when we look at our most common or voluminous calls for service, this remains the same in every report we do. For the most part, we see a large cluster of both proactive work, traffic-related enforcement, and social disorder in our most common calls for service. So looking at police assistance, traffic enforcement, motor vehicle collisions, unwanted person, ambulance assist, etc. We have removed 911 hangups from this list. I am excited to say they're down about 6%. It may not feel like that, but they are down 6%. So I would say that that's a slight improvement because we know within the last little bit, they've been taking up a quarter of our volume coming into our communication center. And that's been pretty consistent across most police services in Ontario. About 13% of our calls for service involve a criminal matter. And when we look at our most common charges laid, we see administrative justice calls such as fail to comply, as well as moving into shoplifting and assault. Our officers laid over 8,000 or nearly 8,000 charges this year in 2024 on over 2,000 people. So great work from them. Next, we're going to talk about our crime harm. So just a refresher, when we go into our harm scores, these are derived from Stats Canada, and they're based on national sentencing practices across Canada, as well as the incarceration rate for that offense. So when we see something like 8,000, we can contextualize that by saying like 8,000 days in jail for that offense. That's what that number is. Similarly, when you have something like failed to appear, technically 12 days in prison for that. These are based on actual sentencing types. So sometimes you'll see something like assault be a little bit lower than theft. That's just due to kind of the nature of the courts and people peace bonding out. So there's a lot of context that needs to come with these numbers. So this shows us our 3 measurements mapped across the city. And as you can see, they're all telling a slightly different story, giving us a slightly different picture. So the first one here is CAD. So that's purely volume. Right? Criminal, non-criminal, that's volume. In the middle, we have our crime count. So the taller the tower, the more volume for both CAD and the more crime for crime count. Crime count is down about 2% than last year. And then when we look at harm, this is all of our harm types. The taller the tower, the more severe or the more harmful at that location. So a tall tower can indicate one harmful event. So just remember the difference between harm and volume of those measurements. Based on research, we break harm up into further categories. So we have our community reported harm. You can think of this mainly as things that have a person victim. We use our 1000 codes. That's what community reported harm is. So it takes up 64% of our harm and 59% of our volume. Proactively detected, we parse out mainly because these are things detected by our officers and the great work they do. And traditionally, when we use count and they find lots of things, it can reflect poorly on numbers of public safety, making things look less safe, when in reality, our proactive efforts have allowed us to detect things before they harmed others. So when we look at our proactively detected, we see 30% of our harm, and it makes up 23% of our volume. And then commercially detected, this is mainly shoplifting. And we parse this out because these numbers can be heavily influenced both on reporting and on private resources such as loss prevention. So we parse these out to give a different picture. So commercially detected makes up 6% of our harm, but 17% of our volume. So we do see a lot of it, even though it is low. When we look at our trends year over year, our total harm is down about 8% compared to 2023. Our community reported harm, so that often has a person victim, is at its lowest since 2022. And we're also seeing the average harm per offense reduce compared to past years. So what that means is there are less of them and they're less severe when they do happen. Then we have our proactively detected harm, slightly lower than yet last year. Again, that depends on our proactive efforts as a police service, how busy we are, and how much time we can dedicate to these efforts. And then we have our commercially detected harm. As you see here, over the last 4 years, it has been steadily increasing, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. So what drives our community reported harm in Barrie? Always been fraud. This year, it's been bumped out of the top spot. Break and enter has now entered as our top harmful offense, making up 14% of our harm and 3% of the volume that we actually see, or the 3% of the crimes we actually see, showing that it is a true harmful offense, right? There's not a lot of them, but their harm score is quite high. It has a big impact on person and community. Then we have fraud, robbery, sexual assault. And then theft under, again, is kind of the switch of this, where its harm proportion is 7%, but its crime proportion is 10%. So that's an example where we're seeing it more voluminously. That's pushing it into this list. So I think this is a really interesting conversation to have too, right? When we change how we measure in our metrics, what we see here is when we look at our harm drivers, we have the break and enter, the fraud, the robbery. But I want to bring our attention back to our volume drivers, the things that often take up the most time and are called in the most to our police service. That's police assistance, unwanted person, ambulance assist, police information, and domestic. So again, I just want to show kind of those conflicting priorities as police in terms of what we need to prioritize and triage as it comes into our communication center and managing our resources. Looking at our proactive harm, so again, this refers to things our officers detect, done by their great work. Our largest proportion is possession of weapons, so it makes up 1.8% of crime, so a low percentage of crime, but of course, a very high harm score. So 20% of our proactive harm is possession of weapons. Then we have some of those administrative justice calls, and then we have drug enforcement as well on this. I wanted to highlight 2 cases that happened at the end of 2024 that took up a large proportion of our proactively detected harm. It's great work done both by specialized units and frontline, and both incidents resulted in seizure of firearms and drugs. So then I'm going to talk about commercially detected. So usually when we look at commercially detected, we have to consider reporting and private resources, right? Has a store hired loss prevention, and therefore they're finding a lot more shoplifting. we have to take this kind of carefully. But something we have noticed is that commercially reported counts in harm has consistently trended upwards over the last 5 years. And another thing in the importance of working with operations is looking at the complexity. So the nature of these commercial crimes has changed. We're seeing more involvement with organized crime in these areas. So what we've done as an analyst team is been able to find our most targeted areas and dig into the context where we can start using our 3T, our target, test, and track method to start tackling some of this and leveraging potentially our community engagement and other specialized teams to assess that. So just a quick refresher on hotspots on the topic of research, because we're going to talk about our hotspots and then hexagon deployment in a minute. So what is hotspots? Basically, the research looks at crime is not equally distributed across time and space. It's clustered, and it's clustered in neighborhoods, street segments, intersections, all of those pieces. Crime is extremely clustered, and so is harm. Harm is, in fact, more concentrated. So ideally, the theory is that crime prevention maximizes its effectiveness by targeting these micro geographies, places where we see consistent crime. Hotspots is guided by research around the crime triangle. And so the crime triangle notes that crime is likely to happen when you have a motivated offender, a suitable target, and the absence of a capable guardian. By adding police in these areas as both a capable guardian and potentially a manager of places, which could also be through CEPTED principles, we intercept that triangle, making it much less likely for crime to happen. And it's not even about being a visible presence there to catch crime as it's happening, but prevent it before it starts. Now, preventing crime is extremely hard to measure. It's hard to measure what you stopped. In fact, there's no way to really measure what you stopped because it didn't happen. So the best we can do is compare locations prior to our hotspot checks and after. So what we've seen is compared to 2023, we've had a 34% reduction in harm across our specific 7 hotspot locations. We also have not seen any displacement. And by doing this, likely, like I said, we can't predict, but likely prevented victimization and enabling our officers to focus on high priority. And then I'm going to pass it over to Sam.
Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be discussing our decision-making process when leveraging the data we have access to. So within the Barrie Police Service, specifically between Madison and I, we have a lot of access to our reported information and data within the service. And I think it's pretty evident through Madison's slides that we do have the ability as well to measure that data in many different ways. But the data itself, we can parse out dependent on what we want our main focus of assessment to be. Things like occurrence data, persons data, charged persons data, charge data, victim data, address data. Those are all different ways we can assess the city and the activity taking place. However, with respect to this presentation, we're going to focus more on just address specific data and how we leverage that and what we prioritize with that information as a unit. So address-based data is a pretty traditional method within a police service to help us identify potential areas of concern and issuing those specific notables within locations and areas throughout the city, specifically on address-based information. This can help us support our decision-making process through operations as well as analysis, and we can identify trends within these locations, deploying our officers there. Things like our harm spots, for example, we've been able to target, test, and track, and that's all through address-based information. However, with saying that, address-based data along with police data in general, there's always going to be limitations and considerations to note. Looking at police data as a whole prior to any form of assessment, there are going to be limitations. At the top of my head, we have underreporting. We have the decades and decades worth of information, the migration from paper to paperless. There's always going to be those things to consider prior to any form of assessment. But with address specific information, Specifically, we came across a couple limitations that we further discussed and brought to fruition some things we can utilize to deter those limitations from happening. This is just a little case study that is obviously fake and I made it up, but it follows similar context to what we've seen when looking at address-based data. So with address-based data, again, our main focus are specific locations of the city of Barrie. If we wanted to prioritize specific locations, it's linked to viable addresses throughout this jurisdiction. There are instances, for example, where occurrences can take place outside of a specific building. So for example, if 110 Fairview was where the occurrence took place or where we thought it took place, however, it was just outside of the building, there might not be a viable address linked to this occurrence because there was no relationship specifically to the building. It was just almost a coincidence that the incident took place outside of. So when looking at our address data, we recognize that restriction. But with saying that this incident still happened, it still got reported. So when we discuss our other forms of data that we can look at, occurrence data, it's going to be within that data set. Offender data, we have our offenders, they got charged. It's going to be within that data set. Victim data, same thing. We're only restricted to address-based information in this purpose. So before jumping the gun and making this a serious issue, we kind of pivoted to research to see if anything's been done in the past, if other services have kind of highlighted this specific concern. Even beyond that, are there other forms of deployment or analysis to address areas of concern throughout a jurisdiction? Sorry, I kind of moved it forward there, but we came across grid-based mapping specifically through hexagonal layers. Grid-based mapping is overlaying a specific uniform grid across a jurisdiction and merging that with data, any form of information you'd like, and aggregating the two together and assessing that information based on a grid ID. Research specifically highlights hexagons being the most spatially accurate in terms of, it's able to reduce the modified aerial unit problem, it minimizes edge effects, and it overall connects more seamlessly. The discussion between shapes of triangles, squares, circles was all spoken about and it highlighted their pros and cons. However, hexagons was more spatially accurate when it came to geographical analysis. So we kind of wanted to look at and see what that would look like within the Barrie Police Service. And essentially what it does, again, these are just plots on a map at a random spot in the city. There's no information given here, but just for a visual purpose, we have our plots on a map. And occurrence data specifically, I should note, there's always going to be an X and Y coordinate linked, no matter if there's a viable address or not. So with our occurrence data, we can leverage our mapping software. And again, we can see that some of these points on a map are linked to a building. They might have a viable address, but we can also pinpoint the potential locations or occurrences that might not have a viable address, stuck in the middle of a road, an open space, and so on. And what a hexagon layer would do is capture everything and give us more context to the activity taking place. When looking at this, I like to highlight the bottom red hexagon there because we can see that that building isn't highlighted of concern. There might not be any incidents highlighted within that specific address, but the area surrounding that building is definitely drawing some form of concern, whether that be an increase of calls for service, harm, depending on what our measurement is going to be. We can definitely capture more context with this. And applying this is very simple. ArcGIS is a geographical software that I'm very familiar with. We use it pretty often when it comes to analysis and using mapping strategies. So within ArcGIS, they have a lot of mapping tools and tessellation tools. So overlaying this grid is fairly adjustable and simple, depending on the measurement we want our hexagon to be, which can be an operational decision based on research and so on. But again, the sizing can be very adjustable as well. With respect to this presentation, this was just, I think I measured it by 300. It was just more for visual. But again, if we wanted to go back, make them larger or smaller, fairly easy to do. So once we have that grid overlaid, we can merge it with the specific data we want to assess. And what it would return, again, is fairly simplified. ArcGIS identifies each individual hexagon as a grid ID. And from there, I can kind of extract whatever measurement we want to look at, whether that be the specific harm within that area over a given period of time, the volume of crime happening over a given period of time, the calls for service over a given period of time. Again, it's fairly very high level for this purpose, but with that, once I have a specific grid ID or grid IDs that are drawing potential concern, we can dig a little bit deeper and give that grid ID context. Looking at every grid ID kind of like its own little jurisdiction is a better way to put it, because each and every one of them can draw various concerns. Again, we can identify if it's a call for service, a social disorder, or a high harm concern. And within that, we can identify, okay, what types of calls are we receiving? What types of crimes are happening? Are there trends within that activity? We can also look at recurring people, recurring persons, whether that be from a criminal standpoint or social disorder standpoint. Have we dealt with these individuals before? If not, how can we help them? And finally, the environmental factors is a big thing as well. No two hexagons with crime and with our measurements are going to present the same thing. But even if we collect a group of hexagons based on the same issues, depending on the measurement, for example, if we have 3 hexagons that propose a high severity of harm to the city of Barrie, we can look at, okay, what surrounding factors may play a part. We might have hexagons that have more open space within them, more commercial properties within them, more residential areas within them. So even with knowing that, we can deploy our resources more effectively depending on that factor. We might want police officers to be on foot patrol in open areas. We might want the engagement team to speak with businesses if it's more of a commercial area, and so on and so forth. So again, with that and summing it up, it'll definitely impact how we make our decisions, starting from the analysis to how we disseminate the information to how we strategize and deploy our officers most appropriately. But ultimately, with this hexagon layer and utilizing this within our analysis when drawing information based on areas of concern, we'll definitely be able to interpret our data a lot more accurately this way. That's all I had. But if there's any questions surrounding that, thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm sure there are a few questions. I certainly have a couple of questions from members of the board. Strong, please.
Thank you, and appreciate the update on the crime stats, and then also the hexagon mapping. It's very interesting. I have a few questions just about the crime scores just to start with. So I'm wondering, how often do the scores get updated?
Daily. From what we look at it, maybe more on like a weekly basis, but in terms of what gets extracted and updated into our services.
And follow up to that, like when we are like assigning the severity of the score to the call, that comes from a central source. We don't make up those scores. So how often do those scores get changed?
Every 5 years. So they're adjusted every 5 years, and that's based on national sentencing. So what we saw, for example, is anything relating to cannabis in the most recent one, which was 2022, has either lowered or dropped off because that is not courts anymore. So the idea is it's reflected based on what's happening societally.
And then, if I may, another question. When we're looking at the maps and like with the hexagon or without, with the towers, whatever it is, and then there's some areas that are, say, red or have higher towers, does that correspond to community safety? If I'm looking at the map as a citizen, or like, and I have a high tower that I feel is close to my neighborhood where I live, am I more or less safe, or is there any bearing on that? Does the evidence tell us that?
Right. So it depends, and especially with harm, because you can have the tallest tower, but it can be one incident that was extremely targeted. Whereas some places we see very low harm, but more indicators of social disorder. And that's where we see things like the community safety survey and residents saying that they feel less safe as opposed to some of our higher harm areas. So it depends. It's a very tricky relationship between the two. And I think, you really have to look at what indicators may impact perceptions of safety. And that often is our lower harm social disorder pieces that impact that.
Thank you. And I guess just a follow up to that, like thinking back to that community, like our safety survey and responses that we heard from the public, it's interesting to look at the statistics that we have and see how the statistics do seem to vary from the perception. And I'm not sure what we do as a police
Yeah.
service to try to like align that better. And maybe that's something that we can think about for the future. But like I saw the presentation last month and I'm seeing the presentation this month and
They're telling two different
they're telling
stories.
different stories.
Absolutely. And I think that's something we noticed too, is based on the community safety survey that was presented last month. It noted that certain members of the community are feeling less safe, even though our data is showing that there's less harm. And that's why I put those kind of competing priorities, right? You look at harm and the things that are happening. But then the more voluminous things that are happening that people see more often in terms of the police assistance, ambulance assist, more of those quality of life and social disorder indicators that seem to more heavily impact people's perception of safety rather than some of the actual harmful events that are.
Chief, I can just tell you want to jump in there and then Mr. Khan, please.
Thank you, Chair. No, the deputy actually left me a nice article on my desk, cut out of an old Barrie Examiner. And it was a 1998 article by the predecessor, Chief Jack Delcourt. And it was a article outlining the challenges the chief of the day had within a safe city, but dealing with perceptions of how people felt unsafe in 1998. And again, back then, a safe city then, and a safe city now, but the challenges that people felt unsafe. So I think some great points have been brought up. But just it's not a new problem, but that doesn't in any way remove the responsibility for us as a public safety organization to address the concerns of our community. We want people to be safe, but we also want them to feel safe. And so our efforts will be focused on both of those areas.
Thank you. It's Mr. Ron, it's almost as if you read my mind. Perfect segue transition into this one. And thanks very much for the presentation. I was actually going to ask you to go back to that slide on conflicting priorities. I don't know that it's necessary, Chair. Instead, I'd almost like to have a separate meeting or like in a future meeting, sort of dig into that conversation a little bit more, just in terms of understanding what those conflicting priorities say specifically and how do we address it, as opposed to just hearing about it as a summary in a report. Actually dive deeper into that as how does the board and how does the service address that perception. I did have some questions around it, but I'm happy to save it for the future. The second question, Ms. Sharman, for you was with regard to the commercial crime. You specifically had this slide regarding to one of the malls on Bayfield. In terms of sort of fact versus what appears as a trend, it does appear that we've seen more of this in malls throughout the GTA. It appears like it's sort of reached into our jurisdiction here. My question is really with regard to the capacity and legal authority of private security on private property versus police response and police capability. We're seeing that private security is more sort of watch and document as opposed to intervene. My question with that is with regard to when we see, typically in the past when we've talked about commercial crime, we hear about maybe a trailer being stolen overnight from an industrial lot. Now we're treading into where it still now interacts with the public. There's public safety potentially when it's a smash and grab at a jewelry store, something along the lines. So my question is, what is the policing community discussing with regard to this trend where now these are more brazen daylight attacks, and we still have the limited capacity of private security on private property versus, but it now involves the public.
I think that may be a question for the deputy or the chief. Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. Yes. So with respect to that type of development, we rely, policing within Ontario and within Canada is, we are linked with other services and there's shared information. And so when we look at the development of something like organized crime influencing that, where you have that type of smash and grab, and I'm thinking of one particular incident, which was very much the case. There is a sharing of information, which then allows preventative response, or perhaps our resources are deployed to effectively not allow it to occur in the first place, or it's an immediate redress after, if it has happened and we receive shared information from our partners, we're then able to follow up and stop any further actions there. So it's not, we do recognize it is occurring on an increased basis, but that sharing of information is incredibly vital. And we are part of both a numerous provincial and federal information sharing programs with our e-service partners.
I would like to know, the picture on that slide, by the way, was of a research project we tried at Georgian Mall. So it's not noting that that is one of the commercial areas, for example, that is a hotspot. We tried a research project where we placed a police car that did not have a police officer in it outside of the mall during the busy holidays. So we're still analyzing to see if that had any impact on theft, but that was just an example of kind of one of those innovative approaches we're trying out to see their impact.
Chair, so just to follow, just so that's through you, Chair, the perception project where people see us and they feel safer. And then for those individuals, we talk about routine activity theory and deterrence theory. And the idea is, again, it's you're weighing the options. So if a capable guardian is present or need to be present, does that affect your decision making?
Just a quick follow-up to that, Chief. Does our service have any relationship with any of the private contractors for security in terms of making sure that they're training and compliant and that they know what they should be doing in these types of events?
Through you, Chair. So all private security companies are required to meet provincial standards, and they are required to meet those provincial standards and demonstrate that through the province. So while we do have interactions and relationships on a organization level, those individual companies are responsible to meet the provincial standards. So I can't speak specifically to each of them. I would hope so, but that answers the question.
My last question, Chair, is for Ms. Scott. Just real quick on the hexagonal gathering of information, by the way, mind-blowing, phenomenal. When you collect this data, is there sort of an automation that allows this information to then future flag for any future events that may take place in that grid?
Like predictive? No. Like I would say but in terms of like predictive policing, if we recognize in certain areas that this is taking place, you're saying sorry.
I may have misspoken. Sorry. When you said predictive, I meant if you've gathered information, does it get linked to that grid? And then if a future call goes to that same location, is that officer flagged, or is the call taker flagged that this is previous information known to that area?
So currently how we have it is whenever we update the information, whether that be weekly, monthly, quarterly, that gets extracted and manually put into the software. We are working with other forms of this type of software, so it gets updated, like how we update our data every day would then update with those grid IDs as well. But currently it's just a manual input into the software, and we're assessing it however often we need to report to the city or a given jurisdiction.
Thank you, through you, Chair. While we are looking to have that immediate updating of information, I just want to caution that we're not using any type of predictive, because I think that is a concern of the public, predictive crime software whatsoever. We're using what crime has taken place and the information received to then action. Certainly, while we think there is value in the future looking at that sort of approach, algorithms need to be transparent so the public feels comfortable that we're not doing anything untoward. And I think that's a fair ask and an expectation of our community.
Just a couple of questions, if I may, they're more directed, I think they're operational, so I'll direct them at the chief and the deputy. To piggyback Mr. Khan's comment about maybe in the future, maybe taking a little deeper dive in the conflicting data. Also, what I think would be useful to the board and to the public is our alternative response, because it's not only when we have the data, how we deploy our officers, but it's also how we can respond to these calls that refer to it in alternative ways that will then allow our officers to move up that priority chain. So I think it would be, I think it's something for the future, a future meeting, not today, but I would be interested to hear what alternative responses are in place. What are we looking at? What are we considering to move the, not only in terms of deployment, but to move that to an alternative response?
Chair, certainly, and I think that's and we can put that on a future agenda. And there's a number of strategies we are trying. At the end of the day, we are looking at every option available to free up frontline member time. So not only can they respond to emergency, and that is the bread and butter of policing, is 24/7 to be able to respond to that, but also, as you saw with some of the statistics, if you're able to free up that frontline member time, our members, because this is not just a job for them, they're out there, they're doing proactive, and you're seeing that increase. And that is stopping crime before it happens. It's detecting things within our community. And I think that's an expectation of our community, but where perhaps across North America, you see that dropping off in other places. Our city, our people they're going out and they're doing more every day. And that is something we should, that's something to celebrate. I love to see, not that crime is being detected, that like the number of the harm measure is going up for proactive, but the fact that there's more proactive policing going on is something to truly recognize. Our people are doing great work out there.
Chief, and one last question, if I may. The hexagon deployment. Where are we at what's at that stage? Are we just looking at it? Is there a timeline? We could get a report back as to what the status of that is.
Thank you, Chair. So it will instruct our deployment. Now, it's not one way or another, and that's why you see a room full of some of our members here. It's just one of those. So measuring crime is a challenge in itself. It's complex. It requires multiple measures and certainly social disorder factors in there as well. The hexagon modeling will be in addition to our place-based, because there are specifics to addresses that we have to look at. It's not just one, this or that, it's this and that. And the hexagon certainly is something we're looking to action in the near future. Certainly, that will instruct our behavior over the coming months. Certainly have to report back to the board because there are some decisions that are being made at an operational level with respect to hexagon size and the reasoning behind it. And it will not be uniform across the city. Satisfactory to the organization with the explanation from our analysts and our research that in some heavier in denser areas, the hexagons are required to be smaller. Whereas in larger areas or less dense areas, they can be larger, because at the end of the day, it's about when we look at the research, what can impact those hexagons and visual deterrence in our presence there, and we're able to affect it. So that's forthcoming. Certainly happy to do it at the next board meeting, if you're happy to hear that, or the board meeting after that.
That's exactly right. To some type of a follow-up to when we hear that this may impact how we police our city. Okay, that hasn't changed things, so we look forward to hearing that. Scott and Sharman, thanks again once again for your presentation. I think I speak for the board when we say we always look forward to hearing what the data is telling us and what it's telling the people here in the city of Barrie. So thanks for a job well done. Appreciate it. Continuing our agenda, there were 6 items in today's consent agenda. A community safety survey update, time and attendance, secondary employment, auxiliary and special constable appointment terminations, human resource report, and public complaints. They were all provided in advance. Anybody have any questions or want any of those items pulled? Seeing none, a motion to approve the consent. Sure. Sean, all in favor? Sean, I'd like to hand it over to you as part of the introduction of the Community Safety and Policing Act in April 1st of 2024. We're required to take a look at our bylaws. And yes, thanks everybody for taking the time out of your busy day. Yeah. Mr. Khan, don't take any offense to that everybody's leaving, but over to you, sir, to discuss those. I think there's 3 new bylaws and 1 amendment, please, sir.
Thank you, Chair. And it's funny, I was going to mention to Ms. Scott and Ms. Sherman that they make the boring not so boring in their presentations, and they all walk out the door when they heard about bylaw and policies. So, but thank you very much. Yes, Chair, since I guess you would say the official inception of the Community Safety and Policing Act, I believe it was April 1st. It's, as the public may or may not be aware, it's sort of the first major overhaul of the Act in about 30 years in order to modernize it, make it more effective. Some of the things that were presented in the new Act was basically, aside from modernization, also the realization of an update being required to the relationship between boards and the service and boards and the leadership of service. So some of these are included in here, Chair, and I'm sorry, I'm just scrolling to get to where I need to get to. There we go. So we have 4 bylaws, and in fact, actually, there's something I learned is really to define the difference between a policy and a bylaw. In terms of the actual bylaw versus a practice that is taken internally. But the first one is, Chair, the bylaw number 11. It says respecting the appointments committee, and I don't know if it's public facing to read the whole thing. Sure. So, Chair, with regard to this, then, really, it's just minor updates to ensure alignment with the new Act, but also to ensure that the board is not only receiving, but is responsible. Board members are responsible for ensuring that, in alignment with ensuring that we have adequate and effective policing, that we have adequate awareness in terms of reporting, and who we are communicating with, being the chief and the deputy, and not down to the subordinates. That is the duty of the chief and the deputy chief. So really, that's the first. Yeah, a motion. Yeah, I'd like to move that motion. Yeah, sure. So, Chair, just by way of just a note, and I don't know if all the members have had an opportunity to review this. I haven't received any particular questions. For the number 12, with regard to the diversity plan, one of the sort of notable standouts was an addition just with regard to ensuring that the service is the board is instructing the service in terms of HR and outreach for recruiting purposes to ensure that our recruiting, that our staffing complement, both sworn and civilian, strives towards reflecting the makeup and the diversity of the community that we serve. And I think that it is important that we note that we're striving towards that, while at the same time ensuring that every candidate meets the qualification and the standards that are expected in terms of the role that they would be serving. So it's just a very minor but meaningful amendment in addition to this bylaw. With regard to the final one being bylaw number 13, no major change other than ensuring that it was reflective of the sections as outlined in the act.
Thank you. Any questions? All in favor? Thank you. I'll save my comment till we've got one more. You have an amendment to our financial accountability, a motion to approve that. Mr. Khan? Mr. Khan? So if you could speak to that, please, Mr. Khan, and
Thank you, Chair. So with regard to this, once again, it is to ensure that we align with the Community Safety and Policing Act, and specifically to ensure that we have, and I have spoken with Mr. Turner, to ensure that our reporting, although it goes to the city as one presentation for consideration and approval, is to ensure that we have very clear delineation between board related expenses in terms of honoraria, in terms of any operational and support related expenses, separated from that of the service itself. That's really a notable change there.
if I may ask one question, or I believe it might be an amendment, is 5.4, which is unbudgeted capital items in excess of 50,000 may not be purchased unless approved by the board. That, I think, may be an obstacle. Would, in some cases, we say the board and or board chair. Would that be a reasonable amendment that would allow for procedurally, or would we be offside perhaps with not making that a formal motion to the board? I'm asking if we can't, then that's fine. But if we can, in more practical terms, I think the board chair, I do approve that if something doesn't looks out of whack, whatever, I do bring it to the board for approval. I just wonder if that could an amendment to it that still keeps us on side with the act.
Chair, I think that would certainly keep us on side of the act, and I do believe as well we have the 2 signature requirement there as well built in. So
Chief would be the chief and the board chair.
Yeah.
And just if we have to put it onto a board meeting for board approval, that may be cumbersome for operation. That's what's driving my suggestion.
I'm happy to, at the will of the balance of the board, I'm happy to accept that as an amendment.
Any concerns? So I would, Sarah, can you make a note of that amendment just so that the STAD or board chair? Is there any other questions about number 15, amending the financial accountability? Seeing none, those in favor? Wonderful. Thank you. Chief Johnston, back to you, please, for your monthly update to the board. Chief.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to update the board and the community. Once again, envying the sunshine in those pictures and the warmth. Everyone in shorts, t-shirts, be nice. Can't come soon enough. On January 27th at the Barrie Native Friendship Center, Myrna McCallum and Sherry for the keynotes on the 27th at the Barrie Native Friendship Center. We attended. We had a number of members present to receive some training there. Again, one of our community partners and very much appreciated. On January 28th, the deputy and I visited Canadian Forces Base Borden to attend the City of Barrie's announcement that the Barrie Air Show would be returning to our waterfront in June. The BPS is proud to support this event with auxiliary members as well as our Marine unit who are instrumental in ensuring the safety of spectators and participants. We want to thank our policing partners who have joined us for this event year after year and their willingness to join us in Kempenfelt Bay for the 3-day event. We appreciate the impact that this has on the city. Saturday, February 1st, Chair, as you well know, you were present but didn't participate. The Barrie Police hosted the annual polar plunge for Special Olympics with temperatures hitting -20. I would argue a little lower than that, but with the wind chill, dozens of brave supporters plunged into the Kempenfelt Bay to support local Special Olympians like Barrie Police Service's own Nick Cunningham. Thank you to everyone who came out and plunged or donated to this great organization. You'll note the middle picture there, Plungy splashing our deputy in the bitterly cold water. I don't know if that went over well, but for a great cause. On Tuesday evening, I was honored to be presented the King Charles III Coronation Medal. To be eligible for this honor, a person must have made a significant contribution to Canada or to the particular province, territory, or region, or community in Canada, or attained an outstanding achievement abroad that brings credit to Canada. The Coronation Medal was created to mark the coronation of His Majesty King Charles III, which took place on May 6, 2023. It is the first Canadian commemorative medal to mark the coronation. I'd like to thank MP John Brassard for nominating me, Chair. As is true of anything in policing, nothing is accomplished alone. There are members in this room, members in this organization, and members in the photo that is the only reason I'm standing there. So appreciative of the fact that I just to recognize that nothing is done by oneself. It's with the teams. On February 4th and 5th, more than 50 sworn and civilian supervisors from across our organization took place in supervisor training. 2 days of presentations covered supporting mental health in teams, trauma-informed training, the new CSPA, our records and finance management systems, as well as an overview of the Law Enforcement Complaints Agency and SIU. Thank you to our human resources for their work in bringing together this group. It's not always easy to schedule training like this. But this information sharing will have a positive impact throughout our service. And this does support directly the board's direction to the chief with respect to wellness of the membership. I had the opportunity to participate in a Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police Chiefs Roundtable workshop. There we discussed the role of police in response to persons in crisis. Attendees included police leaders from across Canada, the Chief of Vancouver, as well as the RCMP, OPP, and the Toronto Police Service, and all major services. Speakers included Sir Mark Rowley, Commissioner of the London Metropolitan Police, speaking about right person, right call with respect to mental health challenges and the number of calls that are received there. Certainly what rang true was the Barrie Police Services efforts with the County Simcoe Paramedic Services and the Canadian Mental Health Association Simcoe County branch with respect to our care team. The idea is if police don't need to be there, why are they there? So we are leading the way. At the OACP Labor Conference in Toronto, I joined a panel with Chief Mark Crowell of the Waterloo Regional Police Service and Chief Jim McSween from York Regional Police to talk about preparing for the next generation of police members and the challenges faced. Myself and the deputy heard from a number of excellent speakers. Great value there. Certainly looking to attend that next year as well. We participated on the Equity Forward Research Advisory Council. That's in conjunction with Georgian College, Dr. Gittins. And that is sourcing with our community, an advisory panel to assist us in continuing to improve as a police service. We had our monthly meeting with the city of Barrie. We met the new general manager of community and corporate services, Jeff Schmidt. We discussed the Barrie Police Service and partner support for the upcoming air show, which is a challenge. It's yearly, and appreciating how what an excellent program that's put on. It's just from a policing perspective, there are a number of resources that we have to draw upon from across the province to help us. And with respect to on February 14th, I joined representatives from services from across our community to discuss an update on the City of Barrie's Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan. Representatives from the County of Simcoe, City of Barrie, RVH, Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit, Barrie Native Friendship Center, 211 discussed what they felt were the most pressing issues that could be addressed through the next 4 years of the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan. And Chair, you're well aware that the ongoing work there. Investigative highlights here. In late September 2024, the combined Barrie Police Service, South Simcoe Police Service Street Crime Auto Theft Unit commenced what evolved into a complex investigation involving the theft of high-end used motor vehicles from our dealerships within the city of Barrie and the town of Innisfil. 3 individuals are now facing a total of 53 criminal charges. I'd also like to highlight that this investigation was made possible through funding provided by the Government of Ontario, Ministry of the Solicitor General, through the Preventing Auto Thefts, the PAT grant. On January 31st, after receiving community complaints regarding speeding and loud vehicles in the Essa and Salem Road area, the Barrie Police Service Traffic Unit was in the area conducting enforcement when a delivery truck was observed traveling at 105 kilometers an hour in a 60-kilometer-hour zone. The driver, 41-year-old male from Toronto, was charged with stunt driving. His license has been suspended for 30 days in the delivery truck he was operating was impounded for 14 days. I think it goes without saying that the conditions out there today would require people to be very safe behind the wheel and take their time. On February 6th, the Barrie Police Service responded to a report of a break and enter in progress at a home in Southeast Barrie. Canine search was initiated. After a brief track, a 33-year-old male was located a short distance away, attempting to hide in the backyard. He was arrested and transported to Barrie Police Service headquarters and is facing numerous charges. Barrie Police Service wished to thank anyone who may have been affected by the activity in their neighborhood. While police resources were successfully deployed and utilized and to locate and apprehend the person responsible for the criminal offense, it stops people going about their regular business, and we do appreciate their patience with us. And credit to the at the scene photography for the photos included today. Finally, Chair, excited to announce that registration is now open for the Building Bridges 2025 Evidence-Based Policing Conference. We're already 40% sold out after 2 weeks, so it's in October. We forecast selling out. So the 2 exciting keynote speakers already announced. This year promises to be another exciting event. Detective Superintendent from the Victoria Police in Australia and President of the Australia-New Zealand Society of Evidence-Based Policing, David Cowan, will be attending, as well as Dr. Tamara Harold from the National Institute of Justice and Associate Professor and Director of Crowd Management and Research Council. They'll be joining us as our keynotes, and there's some others coming as well. If anyone's interested, you can visit buildingbridgesedp.ca to learn more. It's on our website as well, but numerous police services and provincial organizations, and it's all under the national CANSEB organization. And with that, Chair, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Chief Justice. Before I hand it over for questions, just on behalf of the board and all the members of the service, congratulations on your King Charles Coronation Medal. I actually checked with Sarah last night because I thought you weren't going to put it in. I was going to put it in, so I appreciate that you did it. But congratulations, and I know Mayor Nuttall is online with us, and he received the award just before the New Year. So quite an honor, and thank you for all the years of service to our community. It's well deserved. So, any questions for the chief? Seeing none. Oh, he's got his got his Team Canada shirt on. Yes, there's Mayor Nuttall. Seeing none, a motion then to move in camera in accordance with section 44(1)(b) of section 44(1)(b) of the Community Safety and Policing Act. Done. Just for members of the public, that will conclude our open meeting today. So we will not be reconvening after our in-camera meeting to deal with legal and other matters. I thank the